Good morning. Welcome to the fifth webinar organized by FELAEN, Latin American Federation of Endocrinology. Today's event is titled The Metaverse of Technology in Diabetes, Organic and Digital Convergence. I am Pablo Frecher, and I'm greeting you from Panama. I'm an endocrinologist, an internal medicine specialist, head of the endocrinology service in Panama, of the Metropolitan Hospital Complex, and the faculty member of the School of Medicine. I'll mention some relevant aspects of this session. Please keep your cameras, microphones, and cell phones off. We have simultaneous interpretation, English to Spanish, available on the icon of the globe so you can access the language of your preference. We will respond to the questions sent beforehand on the registration process, and you can also write your questions in English or in Spanish during the transmission in the chat that's on the lower part of your screen. This webinar is being transmitted live in our YouTube channel, and it will also be at demand in our webpage, Facebook, YouTube, and the Global Education channel of the International Society of Endocrinology, ICE. I would like to introduce now Dr. Cesar Lam, who's accompanying us here in Panama City, with whom I'll share the coordination. Dr. Cesar Lam is an internist. He has a specialty in endocrinology and diabetes from the National Institute of Nutrition, Salvador Subirán. Dr. Lam will now introduce our speaker. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Pablo Fletcher, for your kind introduction. I greet you from Panama City. For me, it's an honor to present Dr. Alex Ramírez. Dr. Alex Ramírez is scientific advisor, GPS of SUDA. He's an endocrinologist in the Las Americas clinics. He's also an investigator in the metabolic line of Biosciences Sur. Upon concluding his presentation, we will have a Q&A session. Welcome, Dr. Alex Ramirez, and thank you for being with us this morning. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Dr. Cesar, for your kind introduction. I would also like to express my feeling of gratitude to all the Latin American Federation of Endocrinology and its board in order to allow me to present this academic space with you. So the topic at hand is the Metaverse of Technology and Diabetes with an approach of an organic and digital convergence. But let's begin by asking ourselves first the following. What do we feel when technology looks at us in the eye? Do we feel confidence, insecurity? Do we feel fear? What are these sensations generated by technology? Or what if we stop and look at this example on the slide? It's the first android from the Middle East. And by the way, her name is Sara. The name of this android has advances in artificial intelligence, and she has participated in results and studies with interactions with childhood populations in managing patients with diabetes. So why do we talk about what do we feel when technology looks at us in the eye? Because technology is in our day-to-day. We need to be aware of the fact that we are living a digital transformation. And this digital transformation has been going on in different sectors for many decades, but let's close now the spectrum of the digital transformation of different sectors in society. And now let's get closer to this metaverse, specifically in health, and the invitation in the following minute is to the metaverse and diabetes. until we're able to dimension the impact of new technologies in this segment. But let's get started from the foundation. What is a foundation? Digital transformation at large. If we go back a few decades, nowadays it is clear that communication and information technology are part of our daily lives, and this is due, among many other aspects, to the development of computers. And it goes hand in hand with a series of technological elements such as cable internet. In addition to that, it allowed a massive expansion through cell phones and wireless technology. So far, we have not mentioned absolutely anything about health. These are all the segments in society that have been transforming gradually until it has generated a migration towards the digital space with increases in productivity. And clearly, our health sector is not foreign to this social contemporary process. That's why when we seek for a direct association, we see how non-communicable diseases, not exclusively, but very importantly, because of their behavior, their prevalence, and in addition, the social and economic burden they have, they play a key role in digital transformation. But well, we'll not only mention digital transformation, but digital transformation has brought about state of the art concepts such as digital ecosystems. This is a document consulted last year, but it's been evolving for many years. It talks about digital ecosystems as powerful forces that remodel transformation or in general industries. Once again, moving away from the health sector to talk about the society at large. And digital ecosystem as such have many definitions, but they have four main elements. First, they're a set of capacities and services that integrate participants within the framework of a value chain. Clients, providers, platforms, and services. First point. Second point, it's a quote unquote commercial model. Common. Third, the spine that's based on virtual data, and fourth, the construction of efficient processes. These are four elements that pertain to digital ecosystems. And if we go directly to health, what relationship would these definitions have with our segment? First, the potential of a personalized experience of all sorts. Second, the integration of our more than consumers, our patients, our actors in all our processes. Third, the inherent improvement in productivity. And fourth, linkages with other actors in the process, such as caregivers in health. So if we immerse ourselves in this concept of digital ecosystem and we extrapolate it to the health component, why are so many forces nowadays generating elements that have a great impact in the framework of digital ecosystems? Here we have five key elements. One, the potential of improving efficiencies. Two, the capacity of investment in many industries when they point at different segments, including health. Three, budget in technology that patients currently have and countries, basically, especially in the spectrum of underdeveloped countries. Four, the interaction with different segments. And fifth, regulatory changes. What I want you to see is that all these elements, these concepts coalesce from a social and technological standpoint with the health segment. Before talking about diabetes, let's talk about the transformation of healthcare. Thanks to digital transformation, we have three main scenarios. One, health in general. Two, big data. And three, precision approaches. And we take these three major platforms and we hypothetically correlate with the different elements of these platforms. A similar image like this one you see is what we will find. Precision digital health, and big data. And if you see in the different segments, there are a series of elements where a series of data are captured, but not only data, but also the interactions that are generated and all this network of intricate infrastructure. Let's see one element so we see what the major benefit would have to have these three platforms interacting in sync and with these dimensions. Predictability and predictability within the health sector, you know, it's key. By the way, one of the major processes in understanding the natural history of a disease, if we talk about one of these platforms, digital health, and we go a step beyond, we see how all our patients can have an interaction from different perspectives. And I'll simply mention some of these processes now. Emails, how you can communicate yourself through them, through platforms, web-based platforms, apps, text messages, handheld devices, all biometric devices that we'll see later on that are fundamental. For example, in continuous glucose monitoring, all platforms that use images through cameras in real time, platforms that are specific for medical investigation or research, virtual interaction with different scenarios. As you know, this grew after the pandemic when we were in the lockdown, after the lockdown, and all the elements for interaction we currently have. Each and every one of these processes and each one of these elements are part of digital health. Just to mention one of these three platforms, big data and precision focuses. Now, in this scenario and technology, specifically digital health within the framework of a chronic condition, a non-communicable condition, what role would it play? Well, in the element of intervention, research in pathophysiology, complications, and there we would have to assess what elements or technological elements could interact, how soon could we use it, how much information would it provide, how useful would it be from a preventing and predictive standpoint, what applicability does it have at a therapeutic level, and fifth, prevision and follow-up. Now, let's take this to practice to make it more tangible. Now we have all these processes of the elements of the evolution of the disease, and we have two additional ones, genetic studies and the science of bioinformatics. And here on the left of the slide, you will see precision medicine, and on the right, we'll be talking more about the interaction with a digital ecosystem. And here on the right, where we have the interaction with the digital ecosystem, let's focus on three. The component in the preclinical phase of a metabolic condition, as well as a component on a clinical phase, and also the component of complications. This is a simple example. In the case of preclinical phases, follow-up through physical activity, it would be fundamental to do it with interactions in this digital ecosystem. It could be very useful also in assessing eating habits, and later on in the talk, I'll show some evidence in that regard. Preclinical elements in weight loss. Imagine if we had a technological resource that avoids weight gain or that generates weight loss in our patients, that would have a significant impact. The evolution of non-communicable chronic diseases. On the lower part, clinical phase. Why would it be important here? Because we can provide education that will have a big impact in our patient. Two, advanced measurement of glycemia, which we will see later on. Three, improvement in adherence. We know that currently within the framework of non-communicable chronic diseases, especially in metabolic diseases and those that have to do with carbohydrate metabolism disorder, it's a fundamental pillar in management. And four, interaction through digital ecosystems and the health care staff, that human interaction gives a greater sense and relevance to our population. And finally, at distance follow-up anywhere around the world. From the standpoint of complications, well, the assessment could be a great advancement. And second, the therapeutic component that goes hand in hand with a significant follow-up. These are some of the elements that are examples where the interaction of the digital ecosystem would have a great impact both in the preclinical, the clinical phase, as well as the assessment of complications in general. Now, let's go a step further and let's talk about how this would look like in managing not only non-communicable diseases, but in our case, diabetes in a digital ecosystem. In the definition of ecosystem, what is it? It's the interaction of biology with other elements. This is a graphic representation of an information flow within the framework of digital ecosystems. And in this digital clinic, we will have care that would obviously be in person, but a series of processes are interacting within the framework of an ecosystem of virtuality, data, laboratory, diagnostic images, depending on the strategy, apps, interaction with physicians, biometric elements, elements through smartphones, follow up through platforms, and everything that's linked here. Just imagine for a second all these processes articulated in the framework of the follow up of our patients and linked to other elements such as interconnectivity, the use of portable devices, that is clearly a reality nowadays, and elements in a digital ecosystem framework that could be georeferenced, for instance. Just imagine if you knew where your patients are located in real time, not only their domicile, but also in real time. How important would that be to obtain information as to, for example, where the patient could go if they have an emergency, if they have a non-communicable disease such as diabetes? All this consolidates the concept of digital ecosystem. Well, let's move a little bit more and let's get closer to the technological component in diabetes. How do we construct this digital ecosystem? Something important to note is that there is distal technology and the other component is proximal technology. What is distal technology within the framework of diabetes? It refers to each technological resource that is not necessarily in touch directly with the patient. For example, clinical history, apps, software of all types, web pages, and platforms where you can titrate insulin. This is articulated with the component of proximal technology. In the case of our diabetic patients, it becomes more and more tangible. These concepts that used to be ethereal and confusing now, we can apply them in the diabetes component. For example, provision of insulin that goes from pens all to continuous infusion pumps with insulin. Also, the articulation of these insulin continuous infusion pumps with continuous glucose monitoring devices. So we can understand how diabetes within the framework of non-communicable diseases, it plays a key role because with elements such as these, distal and proximal technology come together. But let's go a step further. Many of you might ask yourselves, well, among so much technology and so many resources, is it possible that it has any use in diabetes, all this technological metaverse? What does the evidence show? This is a revision. It's from this month. I did this revision for this talk. I use very specific filters during a systematic review in two languages using clinical trials or random assignation, meta-analysis, or systematic review. That's one of the filters I use. And we found that with only digital health, we found this number of publications, over 18,000 publications. And if we just see what happened in 2025, this is just these articles. There's many other articles, clinical trials, systematic review. There are 2,700 published only this year, up till July. If we add to that digital health, just the diabetes components, of course, we don't have 18,000 when we just did a search for digital health. It's 1,131 just for diabetes with all these filters. And 195 articles up to this moment of the year that speaks of the dimension of publication, its impact, and the creation of evidence. So to assess evidence as a whole would be practically impossible to execute. What should we do then to assess the evidence? And here is an important recommendation. We would need to assess not only the structure of the technological component, but we would need to assess with specific tools or pathologies or scenarios. But since the evidence is overwhelming, we can just barely approach it. So here's are some examples. After the review, articles with the greatest or more recent impact, so you had an idea how to assess technology within the framework of diabetes. This is a publication from 2023 where we looked at assessing the efficacy of multiple technological tools with specific electronic interventions within the framework. And here I'm only talking about patients with type 2 diabetes. We looked for clinical essays with random assignment, with all these databases you see here, with large criteria, greater than 18 years of age, type 2 diabetes, with an electronic intervention once a month that have HbA1c as primary outcome. 88 trials in the meta-analysis of a total of 13,900 patients. What interventions were assessed? Comprehensive or combined measures of all these items. We have apps, calls, SMS, websites, portable devices, and current care. Remember, I mentioned all these elements when I mentioned the interventions in digital health. Now it's specifically for diabetes with all these interventions. Summarizing, what were the main results? Main characteristics, gender distribution, 55% women. Great difference. Age, 57.6 years. Here we need to see something important. Technological interaction not necessarily correlates to age. Third important element, ethnicity. In this case, 56.8% were Caucasian with this distribution worldwide. In a while, I'll mention why I'm emphasizing this as a difference in culture or language. Patients in the intervention, these is a graph that you know. This is a meta-analysis in network when there is a common comparator and the interaction lines get thicker depending on the interventions or the combination of the interventions. And I'll mention the most important conclusions. In these scenarios, with these characteristics in this population group, meta-analysis network, patients with type 2 diabetes, the greater technology was SMS, then apps, then a combination of all, followed by websites, and finally calls. Calls are the last interaction. The most common one was text messages. Another element. The intervention subgroups are more effective in lower than 6 months. Why is this important? Because technology also fatigues, and we can expand on that in the Q&A. Finally, all interventions have an important use in our patients that live with type 2 diabetes. In a previous article, I mentioned the latitudes here. We assess specifically electronic interventions in patients with type 2 diabetes that had obesity as underlying disease that were Hispanic or Latin. We did a systematic review of studies in Spanish and English. These were the assessments that were done, digital health. what you see on the slide. And here we have a high burden of our Latin population, 45.5%, with this profile and with important elements such as these. First, 63% of patients had positive results in this sense. Second, 67% of the patients had improvement not only in their outcomes of HbA1c, but also weight. Third, idiomatic element is important. When we had both languages, generated more interaction. It seems something basic, but it's important to bear in mind in our Latin populations that live elsewhere in other places. Fourth, superiority of the combination with digital health. And finally, the intervention is more effective in the first 12 months. Why? Because technology generates fatigue, so we need to see how to use it. We've talked about patients with type 2 diabetes. This is what happens in type 1 diabetes. This is a revision. This is the past 5 years and the positive impact or not in behavior changes in patients with type 1 diabetes. 5 areas were considered in the slide. The top 10 of the findings, I would just like to mention five. First, technology attenuates the burden of the disease. It's super important. It facilitates many things. Two, we need subgroup analysis for specific clinical outcomes. Three, the fact that a patient adapts the technology does not guarantee they will participate. So consider that because of the fatigue element. Another important point, the positive impact on quality of life. Why do we mention this? Because quality of life is very important for our patients, even if it's not a hard outcome in a series of studies. And another important element is individualizing what selection of technology do our patients use. And finally, collaboration, commitment and collaboration, the patient, their support network, the education team, and the clinical staff that accompanies the process. Among so much technology, apps and platforms, everything I've mentioned, there's a question that's quite common. Which technology and for whom? And here we have two elements on how to select technology. One, considering clinical outcomes. Control, that is effectiveness, type of glycemia, and safety. And third, outcomes in terms of quality of life. And that let's mention each of these platforms or technological tools we currently have: apps, web pages, platforms, big data, continuous glucose monitoring, everything you see here. And this graph helps us to see where we have more impact in case of HbA1c, quality of life, and the interaction between the three. Continuous glucose monitoring, both in real time as well as intermittent, articulated to an infusion pump. That's where the benefit lies, both in safety, in control, and quality of life. And once again, we evoke the term digital ecosystem. Now, how do we decide? There are other processes that can help us to reach a decision. So we have the elements of patient, clinician, and the insurance company. On the left, these are the elements we need to bear in mind from the patient's standpoint. On the lower left, the clinician, all the elements to bear in mind, and the payer, depending on the country, a series of elements. What does this message point at? The model of shared decision in the specific case of each platform. And finally, the team that accompanied us in this publication process. This is just to open your appetite a bit for reading more. This is a publication from the university where we assessed in our country how we could profile the use of different technologies. Why is this important? Because we have all these concepts that seem very ethereal, what happens in our country and what might happen in other scenarios in Latin America. So, recommendation, take a look at it. There's some practical tips on how to profile technology in our patients. Now, in this final segment, after talking about all the ecosystem and all the metaverse, do we, in a country such as Colombia, a country in Latin America, are we close to that metaverse? How far away from it are we? So once again, in the field, what happens? This is one of the best ways of doing it. Let's imagine this is 5:30 in the morning to 23:30 in one same day. This is a patient that has glycemia between 180 and 70, and he has these points. They don't look that bad in terms of control, especially if it's a 23-year-old patient with a type 1 diabetes and HbA1c of 7.3. But if we see this other image, we see that a continuous glucose monitoring shows different metrics different from HbA1c. You see how the patient has a high burden of hypoglycemia, also hyperglycemia, and this is an average we need to bear in mind. Why is this important? When we have continuous glucose monitoring, just by offering this scenario to our patients, we are going straight into the digital technological metaverse. Why? Because this can be translated into population management elements. So when we have with these digital platforms, we can obtain data from our patients in real time, and we can do a populational analysis. And platforms such as these, when they consolidate the information, we can give reports on how our population is moving, and that's how our patients have many steps taken within a technological metaverse in terms of diabetes. So all these elements I'm showing with the due permission of the company I work for is to show what we have. This in terms of continuous glucose monitoring, articulated platforms for continuous glucose monitoring, and developments from the company to see the component of the population management dashboard. This is not exclusive for my company. I know there are many examples in Latin America on how to do population management through technological tools. This is just a snapshot on how you can consolidate all this systematized information. So these are elements of big data. How can we articulate the results with diagnostic tools, with lab, with patient adherence? All this is a reality, and that makes us to become immersed in the metaverse. Direct technologies in health, specifically for diabetes, we can articulate these processes with continuous monitoring devices for glucose, insulin pumps, titration apps, nutrition apps, interactions with elements such as educators, physicians, and clearly in the center of the process is the patient. So you see this digital ecosystem that seems so ethereal, we can take it to a reality here in Latin America. In these final minutes, I told you that the lecture had a second segment, an element where we wanted to see that convergence specifically between human, organic, and digital. And for that, we'll close by talking about digital twins. Digital twins are a revolutionary tool that promises to generate a redefinition in the interaction between organic and digital. Here's something interesting. They are not exclusive of health. Clearly, they are also applied in manufacturing, urbanism, agriculture, and others. Why? Because it's a very promising technological tool. Mainly why? Because of the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, processing speed, virtual reality, and big data elements within the framework of the cloud. So these digital twin tools are now a reality. And so We have all these elements you see in yellow that allows us to optimize processes, to design, to give maintenance, efficiency, and personalization. These digital twins in general, what are they? They're virtual replicas of processes, objects, or physical systems with the objective of simulate or anticipate the behavior. That doesn't mean that all digital twins are the same. They are classified in four elements. One, components, active, system, and process. So before talking about health, you have like a part of a car, the full car, and a car with different interactions and the different processes. That's how the digital twin would look like, all the way from a part to a vehicle system. So let's go to our sector. What happens in health? In health, does a digital twin make sense? To have biosensors, portability, biometrics in health, they make all the sense in the world because we can create, simulate digital elements that are very similar to the behavior of humans in many scenarios. And that allows us to develop drugs, optimize treatments, and all these processes that in health in general, but specifically in our area, which is diabetes, then interactions are generated. And you see how in the center of patient care, around all of this, from prevention, we have an interaction of all these processes with the different lines you see here, very close to the image I mentioned about predictability. This is being done nowadays through digital twins. So I've given a couple of recommendations. I'll give you another one. This article you see here, where all these tools appear, was published by a person from here, from Colombia, that works in AI and diabetes. And she did an in-depth review of the potential of digital twin would have in non-communicable diseases, particularly diabetes. And she looked at the alternatives both for type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and to describe very specifically all the processes and points of a digital twin in diabetes, specifically being clear about the entry points, the outputs, how to put all this information in the digital platform, how the platform interacts with this center where the digital twin would be. And there are entries that are generated not only by the patient, but also laboratory diagnostic imaging. Optimal processing is generated and the output is given through the platform. In this case, it would be with an app interacting with a smartphone. What is the future? Digital twins in health are becoming a reality, especially in diabetes, because of this cycle of entries. And to conclude, is there evidence or not? Of course, there's evidence. This is just an article. 1 year follow-up after an intervention with a digital twin in a type 2 diabetes in a retrospective real-world studies with a number of patients published here. 1,853 with some inclusion criteria that were very simple, with a high intervention in technological monitoring, with watches, with scales, lab, nutritional data, and the interaction between processes such as the selection of food, motivation, physical activity, drug adjustments, with or without insulin, and even the sleep wake cycle. And in these results, we see very specifically reduction of HbA1c from 8 to 6.3. 89% of the patients reduce their HbA1c below 7. Weight reduction statistically significant, 76.9 to 72, without serious hypoglycemia, with a reduction in drug interventions like sulfonylureas and insulin, with a positive impact of lifestyle changes. In the graph, you see the cutoff points, the changes in time, in range, above and below range, and also changes in treatment interactions in health. A specific example of the result of having a digital twin in diabetes. So, to the question of how are we with regards to a metaverse in health and in diabetes, first, the metaverse of technology in diabetes is not the future, it's the present. Second, we are part not only of existence, we're part of the construction. That's why the invitation, and with that, I'll close. We have to be aware that we're immersed in a metaverse of technology in diabetes, and we should proactively be part of its construction for the benefit of our patients. Thank you very much for your attention, and we will be interacting soon for your question. And I'm here for any concern you might have. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Alex, for this excellent presentation. And to expand and allow us to delve into that metaverse that you have explained very graphically with very good examples, especially the last article, the publication of the results that were obtained are fabulous. We would need to read this publication in detail to see the type of population, etc. But it's a true example of what we can do if we structure this very well. We have Dr. Cesar now, so he can share some comments and the questions. Congratulations, a very informative conference with all this futuristic information, although you said it's the present. We have several questions from the audience, and one person is asking, how would you deal the digital gap with elderly patients or patients that do not have access to technology? Patients that are offline or that their bandwidth is low. Thank you. The first thing I would like to highlight is that it might seem that technological platforms could be excluding for our patients of different age groups. And that's the first point to clarify. Definitely not. Any patient from any age group, children obviously accompanied by their parents, even elderly patients, patients above the age of 65, have ways of interacting with all technological platforms. All that within the framework of a clear leadership from a clinical standpoint on how to use the different technological platforms. I'll give you a practical example. I like to take theory to practice. Here in the different places where we work, we have the interaction, the articulation of the digital ecosystem and patients that have continuous glucose monitoring or pumps or self-monitoring with the exclusive use of glucometry. And we link these patients to all the ecosystem. We have patients from the ages of 2 all the way to 88, obviously accompanied with their support network, parents, their schools, and also pediatric endocrinologists. I don't intervene directly in that scenario. Now, in the adult population, in certain technologies, is there an age limit? No. From the moment the patient has the intention to interact and continuously with their support network, well, for example, in the company where I work, we have patients that are 88 years old using continuous glucose monitoring or insulin pumps in real time. Glucose monitoring in real time. Why is this important? Because we should not exclude patients according to their age. Second, what is the level of interaction, the direct level, regardless of their social, cultural, and academic level? What support network do we have would be third, and fourth, clinical leadership and technology needs to start interacting with their patients. So in your practice, if you have continuous glucose monitoring, how will the patient generate an interaction with this continuous monitoring depending on the availability of the resource in the country? For example, if they interact with a smartphone, You teach the patient that instead of doing using the strip, that they interact with a continuous glucose monitor with a smartphone, for example. And what Dr. Lam mentioned, which is important, to know if we have the minimum technological requirements wherever we work. Believe me that most times technological requirements are not that high. And technological penetration with smartphones is very big. So we not necessarily need the last generation cell phone. No, sometimes you just need interoperability for the use of continuous insulin glucose monitoring. If you have certain technological specs, you can interact. So these are the nuances when interacting with different age groups. Thank you. Many congratulations in the chat from Feline members. There is a question from a dear colleague from Costa Rica, Dr. Mary Vinocour. She's asking, misuse technology generates false ideas of diets, drugs, the cure of diabetes, even false medical videos. How can we fight against that? Oh, thank to the colleague for that question. Believe me, for all those that are here, we are acutely aware of technology and the patients. One of the elements that threatens the most is globalization of information, and there are data that recognize this is awful, but it's true that over 90% of the information that's circulating in technological platforms, general platforms, are not generated by physicians, not even by the health sector. And there we might say, why? Why is this? It doesn't make sense. Well, the health sector is important for the world. So people that are not even part of a health sector, but they see potentially with their own interests, they have economic interests and not health interests. They use these resources to massify their information. And I say this publicly, what the doctor mentioned has happened to us in Colombia very often. Many colleagues from the Colombian Association of Endocrinology, they use her image, they put up a dialogue with AI saying a whole bunch of terrible things, including the cure of diabetes. There was a video saying that I was curing diabetes, and after that, it was to sell a drug that obviously is totally false. So, first, to be aware that globalization is a reality, and we as clinicians have to try to neutralize it, and the most direct manner is patient by patient. So, I tell my patients, ask me anything you wish. What people tell you very openly, I won't judge your beliefs. I will guide you. At the end of the day, that's what we intend to do. The same with herbal medicine, false substances, and technological platforms. Second, and this is an invitation, we as scientific societies, how can we generate educational material that's sound and highly believable, where we can tell our patients that what they're listening to in the social media, 90% is false. If you want solid information, consult this web page or an Instagram, whatever you consider. That's a second important element to bear in mind, how we need to do dissemination in this sense. And third, and this is a recommendation that is perhaps counterintuitive, but when you see that this information is massified, don't repeat it, don't share, because paradoxically, for those people who use virtual traffic for profit, it increases their metrics. When they affect negatively a healthcare professional, that something that does not respond to reality, they seek for this virtual traffic. People believe in that. So we need to look for the benefit of our patients from scientific societies, create solid content. So these are the three elements I wanted to highlight, Dr. Pablo. Thank you. Thank you for the excellent response. Here we have some questions regarding applicability for medical practice. What tools in the metaverse exist that can help us to simulate um, office visits, to train physicians in decision making in spaces where there are limited resources? Or are there tools in the metaverse to create collaborative networks amongst physicians from different regions, from tele-education without high costs? Super important. First, the invitation is that in each of our countries, obviously here we have the leaders in Latin America, let's proactively seek for the available technological platforms. I'll give you an example. We use quite often, and I can say it openly because, in spite of being trademark, it's freeware. It's an app called Diabetes M. It's an open source app that's compatible with practically any smartphone. And there are the foundations for treating a patient with type 1 and type 2 diabetes, even with the use of multiple doses of insulin. We have the calculation of the dose, the use of an index to calculate accounting based on carbohydrates, the needs per segment, practically everything. And it is accompanied by nutrition with food registration. Probably this is one of the most practical recommendations, and it's free. It's trademarked, but it's massified and anybody can download it. Obviously, these apps have a premium version, but only with the basic version with diabetes M. A patient can use it, obviously accompanied by the healthcare staff. Second recommendation, let's see what devices are available in our country and what platforms are susceptible to use. And some of them can be anchored to specific devices. There's one that's free where it's My Sugar. It's from a specific brand, but using it massively, if you use a basic component, it has index and counting and all these benefits. If we go to continuous glucose monitoring, depending on the device you use, each continuous monitoring usually has a technological platform. So when we move further to insulin pumps, the pump, depending on the provider, also has its own basic platform. On the other hand, there are apps for nutrition. Here we have a challenge, and it was mentioned in the question. We need to use these technological tools depending on our reality, especially in Latin America, where we have many multiverses in the Latin American multiverse. Each country it has different foods or specific foods. So there we would need to become more familiar and in our case, Colombianize it. What are the foods we have in Colombia and so on in the different countries in Latin America. And the third element is also an invitation. We from the scientific societies can develop a process in common, an app in Latin America for our patients. And although that's not something simple we can do from one day to the next, it's something that we can do with a lot of effort so that our patients use technology massively. Very well. Thank you very much for your response. Here we have an interesting question. What lessons if have you learned from pilot projects in countries in our region that have used virtual reality for diabetes? Here I have to mention something. It's my perception. Sometimes we need more expedite communication channels within the framework of Latin America to disseminate our creations. We could become maybe imprecise by saying that we do not have augmented reality studies in Latin America. Sometimes we don't find that literature. If you go into PubMed and the indexes, we sometimes find literature, but I'm sure that some of the initiatives I know from some universities, it does exist. I could reference with augmented reality. in my country, at least, I don't know in this scenario of our scientific society or of colleagues or the ecosystem of education, experiments or augmented reality studies. In artificial intelligence, and that's another technological tool that's very specific, there are many initiatives. We in the National uh, Congress in Colombia, we receive each year poster publications or postulations for oral presentations of research work with artificial intelligence. There are many initiatives. What we can do to project the complications on our patients, what can we do so that our patients, so we can have a projection of hospitalizations. So tools of this nature do exist. What we would need to highlight is that the interoperability that AI generates, maybe they can become circumscribed to one scenario. I'll share an anecdote. In the company, we have a software based on AI that allowed us to categorize the population of patients with diabetes in 5 levels to mention. The first level, practically no risk of hospitalization. The fifth one, very high risk of hospitalization. So we could circumscribe population management to improve the health outcomes of that population group. So in this order of ideas, we have a lot of tools in artificial intelligence, not augmented reality, in Latin America and in Colombia, but sometimes they're close because to massify them, we would need a general interoperability, and that would be very challenging. These are just some examples. I'm sure that in Latin America, there are many more things that perhaps slip through these technological communication channels we might need to perhaps improve. Thank you very much. Well, we're practically ran out of time. There's a final question. What do you consider is the maximum expression of virtual and organic convergence, and in what phase of the natural history of the disease within the framework of diabetes does technology have more use? Perfect, doctor. Nowadays, from a conceptual standpoint and with the practical nuances I mentioned, the maximum expression would be the digital twin. Imagine that some decades back, that was fictional, fiction medicine, to think that all the data of similar patients or populations could we put into a database and know how the glycemia would behave. We are creating a virtual copy of our patients. So I would say, for example, Alex Ramirez, what age is he? What conditions do we have? What monitor met the drugs does he receive? How is his biometrics in continuous monitoring? So they create my digital twin. What is the potential of this at medium and large term? That I won't have to give Alex Ramirez a insulin scheme to know how he behaves. I will simulate the basal bolus scheme on Alex Ramirez's digital twin. And with that result, I can know if that is the appropriate dose or not. Just so we have an example. That happens in drugs, in diagnostic processes, in population management. So currently, that is the clearest expression of the union between organic and digital. With that expression of the digital twin, many of the elements I mentioned come together: distal, proximal technology, software, AI, absolutely everything. That is the maximum expression. And to the question, in what phase of the disease, remember, I show the different phases of the disease, phases of pathophysiological processes can we intervene with technology from the preclinical phase, passing through a clinical phase, and the anticipation of complications in the case of diabetes, that would be it. What is a preclinical phase? Are patients that don't have diabetes but that have many risk factors, and that you do a projection and tell them your risk is greater than, you need nutrition and physical activity, and you're entering the metaverse in the preclinical phase, a clinical phase, what we mentioned in this segment, and finally in the projection phase, how we link the data of our patients so that they tell us what are the projections of complications and how to anticipate. That was a summary answer. Thank you. Thank you, doctor, for your answer. And so we have some questions about the future and some challenges we have in this topic. How do you visualize the future of the metaverse and diabetes in the next 5 to 10 years? Do you think it will replace our visits to the office? Well, doctor, let's play futuristically. In the next 10 years, regardless of how ambitious the projections were, reality is greater than fiction. And that is very important for all segments of society, especially in the health sector. With the capacity we have today, with the tools, specifically AI, with any of the ones we have available, perhaps ChatGPT is the most common one, you can be surprised of the capacity it has. Generate projections. Obviously, there are nuances of computer capabilities and what part of the world you are and how these digital ecosystems are uh, interacting. But what I can tell you in a very compelling way is that technology goes a lot faster in other segments than in health. But in spite of that, we are living a massive acceleration of processes of all sorts. Medicine in our offices up to population management medicine. And then we have the other aspect. Will some processes be replaced? I have no doubt that many processes will be replaced. When the decisions are based on data, beyond that art, the clinical nuances we're all familiar with, we like it and we wish it could be. And anecdotally, I mentioned Dr. Clara Mosqueda. She's an engineer and expert, specialist in AI and diabetes. And of course, she's at the cusp of technological development. And as an engineer, she well, we asked her what is the role of a clinician, and it's very gratifying to hear that say that technological development doesn't make any sense without any clinical leveraging, but we need to be present that our role will change in years. So I go to an office using AI tools, technology, and I'll make decisions. At the midterm, all of those that are here, we need to become familiar with the metaverse. What will my role be? Also in clinical practice, if I know a patient and I show the continuous glucose monitoring, looking at all the factors, probably I know if I have to interact with the patient. That doesn't mean that I will be an automated doctor. I just ask three things and leave. It's the opportunity to explore the human component, to recover all that humanity that was perhaps lost. So the patient feels better cared for, better understood in parallel with technology. Clinicians need to play the role of accompaniment of developers to give sense to that technology. Because if technology tells us this is the answer, you as a doctor, the expert, 20 years seeing patients tell us if what the platform is telling us is true or not. And then you can say it has no use, that it has no biological explanation, or if it shows data that doesn't make any sense from a technological standpoint, from a clinical standpoint, it does make sense. We will not be replaced in the near future, but we need to use that technology and take it in that good sense of the word, the best to our patients. That is the message. Thank you, Dr. Alex Ramirez, for this excellent presentation for all of Latin America and the world, because we have exposure in uh, ISE worldwide. Perhaps not immediately, but in the next hours, the word will spread and it will be very relevant. Thank you for your presentation. Thank for to all the audience for their participation, and this is just beginning. This is here to stay, as you mentioned, and I would also mention our next cycle of webinars for 2025 from ISC and FELAIN. The next dates are September 27th, October 11th, and November the 1st. And in our webpage, we will be publishing the title of the next lectures. Once again, I would like to thank the support team, everyone from FELAIN. Thank you, Dr. Alex, Dr. Cesar, and our thanks to all the participants. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.